A very good afternoon to all of you. It is my great pleasure to invite you to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the Committee for Academic Support on Higher Education and Learning's first interactive webinar by Professor Mohit Sundawala, Associate Professor at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University, on the topic of LLM in the UK, what, when, and how. Before I invite Professor Moise to give his opening remarks, I would like to introduce him briefly. He has had an illustrious academic career, and it would be difficult to do justice to his introduction in such a short time, but I'll try my best. So, Dr. Moise Sundawala completed his doctoral studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science and successfully defended his PhD thesis entitled In the Shadow of Swaraj, Constituent Power and the Indian Political in April 2019. Before this, in 2011-2012, Moise read for his LLM at the School of Oriental and African Studies and received the Best Dissertation Prize along with distinction in all the courses that he registered for. He had earlier completed his BA LLB honors from the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences in 2010 with a very high CGPA. All through his academic career, Professor Moise has been a recipient of prestigious scholarships, including a fully funded scholarship from the London School of Economics for PhD, Felix Scholarship for his master's at SOAS, and a Microsoft Intellectual Property Scholarship during his final year at the National University of Juridical Sciences. Professor Moise has already been involved in rigorous teaching and research activities in various institutions, including London School of Economics, NUJS, and the National Law University, Delhi. He mainly works in the intersection of Indian constitutional thought, legal and political theory, modern intellectual history, and comparative public law. So we are excited to have him with us here today to share the wealth of experience that he has had through his academic career. And now I invite Professor Moise for his opening remarks. Welcome, Professor.
Yes, hello Shireen, hello Risha and everyone else. I'm really glad to be here and speaking to all of you regarding my experiences of having studied abroad in the UK, especially the LLM and also exploring tested regarding my PhD as well. So yes, I've been here. I finished as Shireen mentioned, I finished my thesis in April 2019, and ever since I have been here at Jindal teaching courses in constitutional law, comparative public law to the LLM students, constitutional law to undergraduate students. I offered an elective on concepts in Indian legal and political thought, and this semester again, I'm offering another elective on global debates on constituent power. So, yeah, I mean, it's great to be here, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Moise, for that. And just a word to the attendees that you can use the Q&A feature to send in your questions. And my colleague, Ms. Trapti, she's going to take up those questions towards the last leg of our webinar today. So, Professor Moise, the first question that I have for you, and that is something that everybody thinks about when they're applying for an LLM abroad and even scholarships, is that what was the reason? Why did you decide to pursue an LLM from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, as a Felix Scholar? What was the reason behind this academic pursuit?
Okay, so I would, say I would divide it into two parts. The first was why did I go to the UK? And the second is why did I choose the School of Oriental and African Studies? Now, the reason for going to the UK was I studied at NUJS in Calcutta, and Calcutta is where I live. So I was always a day scholar. I would go to class and then I would return home, and I never really had the experience of staying away from home, comforts of family, the care and protection that parents and elders household provide. And it was also a bit suffocating and stifling. So one of the reasons was that I wanted to really venture out and explore the world. And the other thing was that, especially also because I have a visual disability and I am fully blind, and I had a tough time, studying the undergraduate course, lack of access to reading materials, sufficient materials. And, at that time, I had a scanner and I had to sit and scan each and every text that I had to read. And then I learned from seniors and others that, if I went out India to higher education institutions abroad, the chances of me getting access to reading materials are much better because they have much better facilities which provide sufficient, reasonable accommodation to persons with disabilities. And so they're good. They have a very good support system put in place. I mean, there's nothing of that sort that had access to in India. And so I thought that, if I want to make a mark for myself, if I want to, distinguish myself from my peers, I have to leave the comforts of home in search of freedom, and I have to go to an academic institution abroad, not just in India, but abroad, because, access to facilities would be much better. So it was challenging, daunting, yet it was also very exciting. Now, coming to School of Oriental and African Studies, why I went there is because, I would say that, I would say that just because Romila Thapar also went there, I was very, disenchanted with legal learning that I received in India. The Oxbridge model of analytical philosophy, backbencher law, normative, doctrinal, those kind of things. And I was really frustrated. And I had my teachers and seniors and colleagues and so on. They would always encourage me to look for Oxford and Cambridge as the institution to target and aim for. But I was like, I don't want, I felt like I've wasted 5 years learning this. I don't want to waste another year doing the same thing. Right? The best of teachers, who had come from Oxford and other places as well. So I kind of had a good hang of what their orientation and attitude towards that deeper questions that I was interested was. And so I thought that I should look for something else, and that's how after the process of elimination, and also as I said, because Romila Thapar went there, I decided to choose US over everything else.
Professor Moez, you have shared so many things in answering that question, especially the fact that your decision to pursue an LLM and from that particular university was a very well thought out decision. So it was not something that was just an added qualification, but also the exposure and also to broaden your own horizons and enhance your own experiences. So that is a pointer that everybody who thinks of applying can take from your responses, that you need to really think hard and about why you want to pursue an LLM, from which university, and to what end. So your objectives ought to be clear at the beginning itself. So that was interesting to hear. So Professor Moez, of course, this is about finally when you get into a university and you start studying, then you start experiencing the city life and all of those things. But there's a lot of background work which goes into getting an admission offer of your choice and also getting some sort of financial aid or scholarship, which is a merit scholarship. Actually, Felix is a merit scholarship as opposed to a merit cum needs or a needs scholarship. So what are the various steps that were involved in applying for the LLM admission at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and also the Felix Scholarship? And if you could take us through the broad steps and the process that you followed while applying, and what worked for you in that sense.
The process was very simple. There are many universities you apply for, and at the time of filling the form, they require you to pay a certain sum of money. Many of the American universities, Ivy League colleges, universities have that scheme. Same is the case in the UK. But many of the colleges affiliated to University of London, at least at that time, the application process was free. Didn't have to pay anything to kind of fill in the admission application. Now, I mean, I just filled in the form. I got all the. I mean, one of the things, two or three things are important. You need to get your documents ready, your transcripts. Well, I think is what they require, and added with any work experience that you have, those kind of experience certificates. Then you need your English, qualifications. It's very ambiguous. Sometimes they let you. I mean, I never appeared for any TOEFL because I got a waiver saying that I come from an academic institution where English was my first language. That didn't satisfy them, and then I said, okay, then I'm sending you my piece of writing. Based on that, if this is good enough for you, I mean, I would want a waiver and exemption. I kept on, kept on writing to them because I was absolutely vehemently opposed to doing that TOEFL and so on. And finally, they said, yes, this looks good, and I mean, this is more than good enough for us. I mean, we are waiving off the TOEFL requirement in your case. So it's very, this English. Sometimes they're very strict about it, and then there's no option. You have to go ahead and do it, but sometimes they're not, and you need to explore that option. And then the other thing that you require is your statement of purpose. We can talk about it a little later. And finally, we also require a list of, referees, a couple of people I think who have taught you are familiar with your work. A good recommendation letter from goes a long way in,
Yes.
And I think it's the same for the scholarship. I mean, sometimes, for different scholarships, there are different formats, you're required to fill in a separate form altogether, separate scholarship form altogether. But these days, increasingly with universities, the scholarship application is integrated into the admission application itself. So you just need to be very careful. You need to tick the right boxes when you fill in the application form, admission application, and the scholarships would be taken care of itself. Those are other applications, and alternatively, outside the university application process, there might be other scholarships as well that you might be looking to apply for, which might be slightly separate and separate. And of course, loans and so on. That's possibility today. These days, I see increasingly many people also go for crowdfunding of their master's courses these days. Right. So these are the options that I mean, it was not very well fleshed out when I was going. I completely lacked information when I was joining the law school in SOAS, and but right now things have improved, and there's just a lot of information, because there's a much larger pool of students and seniors whom you can contact and get guidance from regarding this.
That's so true, Professor Moise, because we have to tap into our own network of friends, professors, colleagues in order to get the maximum information in terms of our research. And I think they are a part of our research, apart from not only looking at the websites of the particular universities. It's good to reach out to the alumni of those particular universities and also get information from people who have already completed in terms of those programs from our circle of friends or professors and so on. I think that's a very important point that you made. And of course, 10 years back or even a few years back, the information was not as much. But what is important to note is that even the competition wasn't as much. Today, more people are applying for masters. More people would like to pursue a master's in law as compared to maybe a decade before. So one has to be more serious about how they draft their applications and when they apply and for which program they apply. I think that is something that students should take care of. So you've touched upon it, upon this a little bit, but would you like to share in some detail with the participants the way in which you went about drafting your statement of purpose, curriculum vitae, and scholarship essays? Just broad points about what are the good practices in this area.
Okay, I mean, as far as the curriculum vitae is concerned, I think I had a short CV. I mean, the emphasis in law school, was completely, you know, in a way, it as a, I was misguided that we need a very big CV with countless number of accomplishments and achievements, tens of papers, and there was a colleague of mine who when we were studying in NUJS, we had Professor M.P. Singh as our vice chancellor, and a batchmate of mine, he that at the end of his fifth year, around the end of his fifth year, he said, okay, so I said, okay, so how many publications do you have? And he said, I have 50.
Okay.
And then he said, so I have beaten Professor M.P. Singh. He doesn't even have 50 publications even today, but I have 50 in 5 years. So, it's just obsession with publication, and that's really driving the real, absolutely poor quality of legal writing, especially. I mean, among the other social sciences, I don't see this as a big problem. But in law schools, for some strange, curious reason, there was an obsession about getting published, increased more and more and more. I would say that if you are inclined to academic work, academic research, academic thinking, one good paper in the 5 years of your undergraduate, or 3 years, as the case may be, is much, much better than 10 terrible papers. Right? So I just had a couple of, I mean, and because when I was joining, first year law school, I didn't know, none of us knew how you go about doing these things. So I wrote really embarrassing stuff, and it's really, I wish there was something on the internet which would allow me to delete all of those things, delete even those footprints that are still there. And some people, I went to an international conference, and a couple of years ago, and I met a person who had read a paper that I had written as a first year student, and I was like, no, you can't be reading that. That's not me, right? So you shouldn't do these tens of research papers, tens of internships, tens of competitions and whatnot. You have a curriculum vitae. What really matters is, I don't like to say this, but what matters to get admitted to good school, good university for an LLM course with a scholarship if you want it, what matters is getting a good score in the master, in the undergraduate. You need to some universities are very picky. They only give admission to rankers, but some others are a bit more open-minded, and they value other skill sets that you bring in. Sometimes, the rankers are not the best students, right? We know how the ranking system and the evaluation process in most academic institutions is completely rigged, right? So even if you don't score, even if you don't get a good rank, you shouldn't be dissuaded, but at least you should try to get a good score, right? And that's very important. Getting good, maybe as I mentioned, that's important. That might be helpful. And of course, in your CV, some solid internships, right? Show them that, okay, every summer, every couple of months, I was doing this and I was doing that, and I was part of this committee in the law school and that committee, and maybe you need a short, precise, pithy curriculum vitae. 2 or the best institutions have a limit, because they know that if we don't have a limit, the students are just going to give us very long curriculum details. So 2 pages or 3 pages is, the maximum limit in the best of places. So that's what is required for a CV. As far as the statement of purpose is concerned, I think for me, the first rule, and there are just 2 or 3 rules that I would have. And, the first rule is that the CV should not just be a paraphrase. The curriculum vitae should not simply be a paraphrase of your CV. Right? So this is an absolute don't. You shouldn't. What you have given in bullet form, you shouldn't put it up in paragraphs in the curriculum vitae. In the SOP. The SOP, what you require to put in is, maybe give your. It should supply a narrative for your CV, right? That okay, this is what the CV, they have read your CV, whoever the examiners are, whoever is on the panel of interviews and whatever, they've read your CV. So they are looking for, okay, what else can you give me in the statement of purpose? So, you kind of supply a story. You tell them a story about you, right? And these are certain, this is what has shaped me. These are the life questions as far as I am concerned. This is what drives me, right? This is what sets me apart. Right? Those kind of things. So it's basically a narrative, a story that you need to write. And as I say in all my classes, it should have your own authorial voice, right? And your personality should shine forth in statement of purpose. It's not a rocket science. You don't need to fret about it too much. You don't need to be too anxious about it. You should treat it as a blank paper, and you should think of it as, okay, this paper is giving me the opportunity to unravel myself, to give me an opportunity to write about what really drives me with freedom and with a lot of vigor. Right? So those are a few things that I would say. One is don't paraphrase your CV. The other is tell a story about yourself. Give a which contextualizes or supplies a narrative to the CV. And most importantly, it should have your own authorial voice, right? And your personality should shine forth, and you should be able to distinguish yourself from the rest of the crowd, with the help of the statement of purpose. Yeah.
I think those are very, very important points, Moez, because what students tend to do, and you correctly pointed out that whatever is there in their CV, they try to replicate that into their SOP. But what they don't understand is that statement of purpose is your life story, your own narrative, your own voice, which the panel would like to understand and from reading your statement of purpose. Because see, there are no interviews in an LLM program for admissions to an LLM program, so your statement of purpose is the centerpiece of your applications. Another thing that you pointed out, and which was very important, was that grades are paramount. It's difficult for us to convey this to the students, but many universities are very strict with the grades, and that becomes the first point of selection of a student. If you would like to throw some light on scholarship essays, that would be great, since you won the Felix Scholarship, and how different it is.
I don't remember, Shireen. I don't remember whether Felix had a separate scholarship essay.
Okay.
Right? Yes, Felix. I think Felix scholarship, as you know, if any one of you has done some research on it, they offer it to you in 3 places in the UK.
Yes.
One is SOAS, another is
Oxford and Reading.
So I kind of know people who have got, Felix Oxford, Felix SOAS, Felix Reading, all everywhere. But I think in Oxford it's tied to the admissions process, but increasingly now I feel even SOAS has got it tied. but I might be wrong. I mean, so I don't know. Scholarship essays, again, it should be an extension of your statement of purpose. And what I don't like is in scholarship essays that okay, um, say you come, if you are rich, then it's a different. If you are rich, prosperous community, if if you do all of, if you belong to those sorts of upper caste, upper class, rich, prosperous communities, that's fine. But you know, it's if you are from a lower caste, lower class, different gender, disability, minority, whatever. I mean, I see a tendency among students to kind of use these things as identity cards. They can just invoke this their gender, their disability, their whatever ABC, and then cut a sorry figure, and based on that develop a narrative uh, on those lines, that this is what is really going to impress the scholarship committee. I would say that you under no circumstances you should lose your dignity. You should not go out of your way to show them how desperate you are to get your scholarship, to get your admission, and so on. um, of course you should talk about whatever you know you know axes of oppression you have encountered in your life. But you should talk about it. I would rather say you should talk about it with rage rather than using it as an identity card to attract the attention of the scholarship. Your whatever oppression that you've encountered in your life is much more paramount than the question as to whether you get this scholarship or not. So just to get your scholarship, you should not you should not compromise with your community. You should not compromise with your movement, and you should always carry yourself with a lot of dignity. And you should, if you are from a disadvantaged section of society, you should also uh, you should be encouraged with the kind of structures that you know that, that drive the academic educational framework in India as well as abroad.
I think, Professor Mohit, those are very important points significantly, because there's a lesson there that, of course, you have to build a narrative when it comes to, be it your statement of purpose or your scholarship essays, or if there are questions around the scholarship application. But in building the narrative, we shouldn't be overtly enthusiastic or exaggerate our stories and our hardships. Uh, though, I mean, we have to convey through our writings that this is what we are and this is our identity and this is what we ought to do. But certainly exaggeration doesn't work well with the committees as well when they are assessing applications. Another thing that I would like to just share with the students is that, lying never works. So sometimes students lie a lot about their achievements or anything about in their statement of purpose. But these committees are so accustomed to receiving these applications that they know that a student at your level, what they can achieve, how much they can do. So lying is something that you should stay away from. And you can certainly get into the top universities and get the top scholarships if you are honest about your story and your accomplishments and the kind of contributions you might have made to your university.
Yes, and the same goes with your achievements as well. You shouldn't ever go al bruhaha about I have done this, I have done that. That's very irritating and very annoying. They've seen your CV, they've seen your accomplishments, and you should say something different. You should say something striking. That's the word. You should get them to take you seriously. And every year people come first, second, third, right? So what's the big deal, right?
Definitely.
You get the scholarship, right? Sometimes first, second, third, coming first, second, third is we know how the academic setup works, right? Not the best students, not those students with the best aptitude necessarily rank for second, third in class. So you should always, yes, it's important. It's an important box to tick, getting good grades, but it's not sufficient, right? You
Yes.
need your story, in which the story should not, you should not use this. It should not be I have done this, I have done that. No, neither should you. You play the identity card in an exaggerated manner, as Shirin is saying. Should you exaggerate your? You shouldn't talk about your accomplishments at all. You should let the CV do it, that talk, but and you should rather talk about your statement. What are your animating questions? As a student, what troubles you about this world, what how you responded, reacted, and so on. And what is the vision, what is the imagination that you have about yourself, at least at this stage, in the next 5-10 years, and how do you see the course that you are signing up for? How do you see this course contributing to the larger? And one more thing I would want to say is that don't say the most anodyne, banal things in statement of purpose, right? So they will okay, like why SOAS? That's what the question will always come up, right? And this question also comes up in interviews. Why go to SOAS? Why go to LSE? Why go to Oxford? Don't give them the most obvious answers. It's a very prestigious institution, right? Oh, I want to go to SOAS because see, it's the best place for South Asian law study. I mean, they've seen it, right? They know what the courses are like, and oh, I want to go to Oxford because I love jurisprudence. That's not that's not a good answer, right? So you need to be a bit inventive about thinking a good answer to this question. Why do you want to go to SOAS? Right? I mean, if I were a Dalit, right, and I was going to LSE, then if they had asked, I mean, see, I have grown up revering Ambedkar, and I found out that Ambedkar went to LSE, right? And so, following his footsteps, I want to go there as well, right? So those kind of answers are much much more interesting, because they connect. Don't give them an answer which they can find out from the SOAS website or the LSE website or whichever university you want to go. Don't do that, right? Do your research, do your courses. Yes, there are certain courses which are very curious and fascinating, but don't write about those courses. Write about your engagement, with the themes and the thematics and the topics that you think are going to be covered in these courses.
Yes, all those are lovely points. And in fact, another thing that students should keep in mind is, be it a scholarship essay or a statement of purpose, sometimes the university themselves would advertise on their website saying that, there'll be a prompt that why don't you speak about these things, your activities, your accomplishments, which make you uh, a, a good candidate, a suitable candidate for the LLM program at so and so university. So sometimes they have questions or they have suggestions on what you can write your statement of purpose on, and you should take those suggestions seriously. And even if there's no prompt on the website, or the scholarship panel has not come up with a prompt for you to write an essay on, you should be able to preempt the questions, like Moez just said, that you have to answer in your statement of purpose that why this particular university, why this particular program, how is it connected to your future goals and aspirations, and why is it necessary for you to attend this program in order for you to achieve those future goals and aspirations, while at the same time telling them about your current state and what all accomplishments you have had in the past, but not over exaggerating on those points. And in a way, whatever you write in the statement of purpose, you can use it for your scholarship essays as well. It's just that you have to mold it according to what that scholarship stands for and what are they looking for in that candidate, and you can mold your story accordingly. Last point on this statement of purpose, I just wanted to add my experience also. So basically, you might have done 10 things in your law school, and you might be proud of those 10 things, but you don't have to make sure that all those 10 stories or anecdotes you are going to put in your SOP. You can select 3 or 4 incidents and put it in your SOP, or write about it in your SOP in detail, as opposed to writing about 10 things and not making an impact. And also because many of these statement of purpose word limits are very less. For example, New York University School of Law has just a 500 word statement of purpose. The University of Oxford just has a 300 word statement of purpose. And if you look at Columbia Law School, it's 750 words. So it will become a huge task for you to fit in your story in those many words as well.
You
So,
know, you in I mean, and I say this from my classes. I say this to my students as well, that in law people love verbosity. They love talking a lot, right? And sometimes people talk a lot and they're just saying the same thing again and again and again in different ways, right? So that's around is an occupational hazard for law students. I mean, everyone you know is inclined to do that. So you should stay away from that. You should what you did in your school, essay writing, that you have to summarize. You need to be very precise and very clear about certain things, and you need to do two things. You need to do precis writing and you need to do connected writing, right? Everything has to one thing or the other. So these are a few tips, writing tips, that I always give to my students, that just learn, just recollect some of the lessons that you've learned in school, and that's what is most important. And the same with CV and SOP, especially because the word count is so low.
thank you, Professor Moise. So, Professor Moise, with this, let's look at the letters of recommendation. We all know they are very important, and in every application, be it for an admission or scholarship, we are submitting at least 2 or 3 letters of recommendation. So, if you could touch upon how one should plan their letters of recommendation, and what should those letters of recommendation convey to the panelists? Because many a times what happens is, when we look at a referee, he or she would ask us for some kind of a framework within which they would then write a recommendation, because they're also looking for some kind of a nudge in the direction that we would like to create an impact on. So if you could just discuss the importance of the letters of recommendation, how can students go about procuring these letters of recommendation?
And the first, I would be, I might not be the best person to ask this question to, because the most important rule that I would have as far as letters of recommendation are concerned is to look for someone who knows you very thoroughly, and to look for someone who can write for you without you being required to nudge them in a certain direction. So the letters of recommendation that I have received from my teachers, I never got to see them. Right? And the best letters of recommendation are those that you don't get to see, right? And I mean, I know that it's really unethical. It's really an unethical practice, where the teacher concerned asks you that, okay, you tell me, you write your own letter of recommendation, and then I'm just going to sign up for it, right? Sign up on it. And that's, I think, extremely unethical. I think you should you should absolutely stay away as much as possible from those kinds of people. Try to cultivate relations, genuine academic relations with your teachers and seniors and so on, so that if need arises, you can get letters of recommendation. The only thing that I would say, sometimes puts off scholarship committees and so on, is if your referee, if they're writing a letter, even that letter of recommendation is exaggerated, right? But I was on a scholarship panel just a few weeks ago, and we received a letter from a teacher of a student, and the letter said that, I've taught for 20 years, and this student is among the top two persons that I have taught in my entire life. Right? And then, so just because we read this statement, this extremely extravagant statement that the teacher referee had written, the burden, it unnecessarily put the student under a lot of pressure, because automatically, they would be there would be greater scrutiny if a person who has taught for 20 years, if they're saying that, this person is among the best couple of students that I've had, then and then we found out that the student wasn't able to even answer the most basic questions uh, pertaining to the very course which this teacher had taught them, right? So this kind of exaggeration in your letter of recommendation also does not help. It should be very measured. It should again be very, because it comes to you from a position of dignity, right? Your teacher who is senior to you, who is superior to you in the academic hierarchy, and it should the letter of recommendation should be reflective of that. It should be reflective of that dignity and that grace, that kind of respect. It should exude that respect that the teacher has for you and your work and values and principles and ideals that you stand for, rather than being extremely brouhaha about your achievements and accomplishments and so on. And again, the same. I mean, yes, what your teacher might require you to might ask you to do is that they might ask you to give them give them your curriculum vitae. That's a good practice. I think a lot of it's these days it's not that easy to cultivate face-to-face personal relations with your teachers, right? Especially during the COVID pandemic and so on. And so you don't not necessarily supposed to be very thoroughly well versed with what you have been doing and what your accomplishments are. So they might ask you for your CV. So you give that to them, but then I mean, of course, you can't tell them this point, but the LOR, just as the statement of purpose can't be, in the similar way, the letter of recommendation should not be simply a rehash of the CV. It should rather tell the panel, the scholarship or admission panel, how the referee knows you, and what has been the level of engagement and interaction that they've had with you, and why do they think that you would make a very good fit for this course or this scholarship, right? So it has to be very general, and it should be a comment on your aptitude and your general orientation, academics as well as in life more broadly.
So sorry to everyone, I got disconnected somehow. Yes, Professor
Yes.
Moiti, were talking about letters of recommendation. We can restart our conversation.
Yes, I mean, I was saying, Shirin, that I mean, just to reiterate myself, letters of recommendation. I mean, the best letters are those which you don't get to see. You should try to relations with your academic tutors and teachers, where they get to know you thoroughly. They are familiar with your work, what you have been doing. You should and they are willing to write for you, right? In their own words. There's a very easy and common practice these days that teachers just ask students, just send us what you want to have to be written in the in the letter of recommendation. I think this is inappropriate. It is not a proper practice. It is unethical, and you should try to stay away from it. I mean, as I said about you, that the the statement of purpose should be in your authorial voice. Similarly, the letter of recommendation should be in the authorial voice of the academic, right, who is writing for you. All that they can ask for is your CV, and you should give them, especially in COVID times. It's difficult for them to have this cultivated face-to-face personal relations increasingly in these days. In these days, And so, but again, the LOR should not be simply a rehash of the CV. It should be reflective. It should carry a dignity. It should have some grace. Because it comes to the university from a person who shares a relationship of authority in some way over you, right? So yeah, that's what I have to say about it.
Yes, I also completely agree with this. And what I have seen, Moise, in my experience is that if a professor really knows you and has worked and you've worked with a professor in a capacity which is for a long time, then he or she would never ask you to write an LOR and then work on it. He or she will send it in a way to progress. And of course, students should not fall prey to a system wherein they dictate what is in the letters of recommendation. It should come authentically from the academics that they have been working with. I also completely support that kind of a system. Uh, so the last question before we move on to the questions by the participants is that what are some of the do's and don'ts of the application process for scholarships as well as admissions to foreign universities? And is there anything that you would have done differently if you had known better?
you know, what I would have done differently, um, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I wonder, was it a good idea to to go for an LLM first place? I might have done I might have done masters in what really drives me much more than law, because legal academics I find is a very stifling sort of place, right? So yeah, I mean, you should. The do's are always that so I'm more interested in political thought and political theory, and but at that time I just did not have the information and to and the requisite amount of guidance, right, from my peers and seniors and so on, who could nudge me and uh, mm, direct me in the right manner. So I mean, I had to go for LLM, but I have tried to make the reinvent myself, and whilst reinventing myself, I have also reinvented I try to reinvent the law in whatever courses that I teach. So yes, it is I sometimes wonder whether law can accommodate the kind of interests that I really have. But yeah, I mean, I like challenges, and I'm here to destabilize established strategies. So I wouldn't. I deep down, there are no regrets that I have about having pursued an LLM in SOAS. But yeah, I mean, do's and don'ts. I would only say that you should always pursue your passion, and you should not be very calculative about these things. Okay, you should not weigh pros and cons and then take action. That's not the right approach. You should just do that which drives you, which gives you, which you're most eager and enthusiastic about, and you should not treat it simply as, okay, a career advancement scheme. you know Academic learning is a different ball game altogether. I mean, to use very Kantian, I mean, uh, it's not instrumental means. Treat it simply as an instrumental means. Okay, I will get this, get a better job, and so on. But rather, you should treat it as an end, as a pure end in its own right. Right? So, keeping that in mind, you should absolutely pursue your passion. You should pursue your ambition. You should be pushing the envelope, and you should yeah, yeah. And then yeah, and yeah, one more, the final point is that these scholarships and these admissions and whatnot, you should not allow yourself to get disappointed if one scholarship decision, one admission decision does not go your way. Because, increasingly, I mean, it was true even in my time, but I feel increasingly in today's day and age, uh, a lot depends upon good luck. Yes, you need to have a good record and good statement of purpose and so on. But a lot depends on good luck, purely good luck and good fortune, and also how you perform on the day of your interview. Right? So you should not be, if you win a scholarship, it's not because you are the absolute best in the business. And if you don't get a scholarship, it's not because you are the worst out there, right? You should learn to take things in stride. If you get a scholarship, well and good, fantastic. If you don't, then you should try another time. And maybe and I've seen so many cases where people have applied to 10 places in 1 year and they've not got it. But in the second year, when luck changes, every decision starts going in their favor.
Mm.
You should never lose heart, and you should keep trying. But of course, that doesn't mean that you should keep trying every year, right? Maybe if it doesn't work out a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, then you should look for some other. You should, perhaps time is to look for some other opportunities elsewhere. But once, if you don't get it, you shouldn't be too disappointed.
Yes. And you know what, Professor Mohit, I think that irrespective of where you are in your academic career, you should apply, and you're applying for LLM programs, you should apply for all scholarships that are available. They can be
Absolutely.
fully paid, they can be partially funded. Any scholarship is an experience at the end because you get to sit in the interviews and understand what the committee is looking for. And my personal experience, that has helped me a lot. And I mean, of course, if you get it in the first try, nothing like it. But in case you don't, there's no harm trying another year. And also, what I would like to leave the students with in terms of scholarships is that many of the students think that all these scholarships are means-based. It depends upon your background and your financial status, but nothing like it. Felix, Rhodes, Schevening, I myself am a Schevening scholar. All of these are merit-based scholarships. They never ask you for your financial conditions and whether you are financially sound to go abroad and pursue your higher studies. So it's not only about getting that kind of financial support from the scholarship committee, but it is also a matter of prestige, and it is meritorious ultimately. And in fact, if somebody wants to pursue an academic career later or even in law firms, they do take this into consideration, whether a student has completed his or her master's through scholarships, because that has been my experience at Jindal as well as when I was working at an international law firm. They did take my Schevening scholarship into consideration while I was interviewing with them. So, Professor Mohit, with this, can we move on to the questions? And I'll request my colleague to start posing the questions that the participants have shared. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Moiz. It was actually very insightful and motivating as well. So yes, let's move to the question answer section. The first question is very innocent. It asks, does the grade of last 2 years matter, or the combination of all the 5 years?
I think the combination of all the 5 years would matter, I suppose, not grade of the last 2 years.
Right. Professor, the next question is, universities offer a general LLM along with a specific or specialization. So which one do you think should be preferred by students, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the two?
I would be inclined to go for a general LLM. I mean, when I did my master's, I had an option of doing specialized I knew that I wanted to do South Asian studies and so on, right? I knew that was my area of interest, but I opted to go for the general LLM because if you do a specialized LLM, then you get typecast. So, this fellow has done LLM in this and that area, and therefore they are meant. I mean, it can be exclusionary. It can deny you opportunities. But if you do a general LLM, and you do specific courses, say on, as I mentioned, South Asian law and governance and politics, you can show in your CV, if you want to draw attention to the fact that you're applying for South Asia specific, a job or teaching or a higher degree or whatever, then you can mention it in the CV that these are the courses that I took, and this is the score that I received. So I am very much qualified. But it should not show on your transcript. Sometimes, if it shows on the transcript that you've done LLM in this area or that area, then it acts as a disqualifier. Of course, if you then, but if you're going for a second LLM, sometimes maybe okay, I've already done a general LLM, and then I'm now very sure I have reached a certain stage and a certain age in my life where I'm absolutely sure that this is, say, for example, LLM in regulatory studies, because I want to come back to regulatory studies, and I'm absolutely dead sure about what my future plans are. So in that sort of, yes, a specialized LLM can help, but more general, but broadly speaking, especially if you're a youngster, you just finished your undergraduate, I would say that keep as many options open as possible for as long a period of time as possible.
Right, Professor. So, Professor, the next question is, what did you mean by not just paraphrasing accomplishments in the CV? The students want more clarity on that.
Okay, so you should not. Sometimes CV says, "Oh, I have done this. I was at I worked in these are my grades. This is my rank. These are my internships. These are my publications." Right? And then the statement of purpose would be, "Oh, I have always been a brilliant student. See, I've got these many grades. I've been very enterprising as far as exploring internship opportunities are concerned, as is evident from my internship in this law firm, but not only law firm, but see, I have also actually relevant. I have done this NGO internship and so on, right? I mean, you might not be that sort of student who does this, but a lot I've seen statements of purpose which are like that. They just so CV is written in bullet form, and then a more expanded version of the CV in paraphrase form is to be found in the statement of purpose. I would say that you shouldn't even come close to that. You shouldn't even come close to doing that in your statement of purpose. It should be you should write on a clean slate. Right? I mean, CV is supposed to serve one purpose, and statement of purpose serves a completely different purpose. And you need to differentiate the two.
Right. Professor, the next question is, do you recommend that students should get some work experience before applying to LLM, or is it okay if they directly go for their LLMs after their undergrad studies?
That's not necessary. I mean, work experience is not necessary. I mean, sometimes, outside India, they have this culture of taking a gap year, exploring things a little bit, sometimes even working out for a brief while and then applying. Some law schools and universities across the world, especially in America, they're very strict on work experience, right? Unless you have a 2 years work experience or 3 years work experience, you're not even eligible to apply. Or even if you are, you stand a very low chance of getting admitted. So you need to do institution-centric research about this, whether work experience is what is favored, is what is expected by, say Columbia or Harvard or Stanford and so on, or can you just get in even without having any sort of work experience whatsoever? Sometimes it might just also be. I mean, and yeah, I mean, see, this also there's no harm in getting work experience. Right? You say, okay, I am an academically inclined person, therefore I don't want to go to a law firm at all, or I look down upon law firms. Right? I mean, you might want to do that, but there is no harm in getting yourself that sort of experience, provided you are very sure that I'm just going to be here, and after that 1 year I would want to leave that place and go away. So there are no hard and fast rules, and there are not even any hard and fast rules about work experience necessary. Neither is there any hard and fast rule about jumping into the LLM so just do whatever you find convenient. Also, do a bit of research regarding each specific institution, whether they encourage work experience or they are even with undergraduate degrees.
Right. Professor, it's already 4, but if you can please allow us 5 more minutes,
Yes,
we'll take some few.
Sure.
Yes. Yes. So, Professor, the other question is that while choosing referees, does the seniority of a faculty member matter? For example, if a faculty member does not have a PhD and then the faculty member is recommending, is it going to affect the application?
That's a tough question. I don't. To be honest, I don't know. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter because at the end of the day, they are. I mean, so say it would matter. Say, for example, if you are taking a reference letter from, so seniority as far as designation is concerned, maybe that would matter. So getting a letter from an assistant professor would be better than getting a letter from a lecturer or an assistant lecturer. But beyond that, I mean, whether they have a PhD or not, it should. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't, come across this sort of scenario where even without PhDs, people are writing recommendation letters, and whether these are being successful or not. So I wouldn't. I mean, you would have to do it to find out.
Right. Professor Shireen, if you have any comments on this question, I think it's an important query. Yes.
So, what I feel is that in my experience, even if a faculty member does not have a PhD, but that faculty member is a full professor, that has more weightage than somebody who's an assistant professor or an associate professor. I think it's seen in a better light. And generally, when even I was applying and I wanted a recommendation from an assistant professor whom I had closely worked with, she actually, in fact, gave me this opportunity, and then she told me, she gave me this guidance that you should take a recommendation from a full professor because that person has had more experience in the field. Now, this is all subjective, as Professor Moy said, but to be on the safer side, you might as well take a letter of recommendation with somebody who's a full professor.
But Shireen, what I also think is more than these designations. Of course, the basic criteria is it has to be solid, right? So doctorate and whatever. I mean, if you get it, I mean, for good institutions, I mean, this should be necessary, right? At least getting a doctorate and so on. But beyond that, I think you shouldn't look too much at the hierarchy, whether it is a professor, associate professor, or assistant professor. What really matters is that they are able to competently talk about you, right?
Exactly.
In and out. And that is, I mean, even if you get that, I mean, a very casually written statement of purpose from a professor
doesn't matter. Yeah.
Good enough in comparison with an assistant professor who knows you thoroughly, right? And would be able to guide the institution in a better manner, right?
I agree.
So this, whatever Jindal as a university, whatever its policies are regarding who is an assistant professor and so on, that's its internal matter, and it shouldn't matter to other universities who is who in Jindal, so long as you have that designation over here and it satisfies the minimum criteria. It should be fine. I mean, all that you need to look for is some solidity, and from therein, and also deeper familiarity and knowledge. And of course,
yes.
These are so much for merit, right, Shireen? If it's another one of those. You should be very skeptical about this. This entire reference process that someone who is very high up in the hierarchy, in the academic hierarchy, their word would, such and such person's son, I want them there. And so I would write them recommendation letters. Is this not corruption? So this is basically, if the rich and the elite and the intellectuals do it, it isn't, it gets recognized as
It is. But you know, Professor Mohit,
letter of recommendation
but that
on your merit, and if the lower communities do it, they, you get to say, oh, reservation, and they are not meritorious and they shouldn't be here.
yeah. I understand the dichotomy, and but everything is going on. We know that as well, right? But Professor Mohit, that makes for a very different conversation and a very valid and substantial one, and something that everybody involved in higher education should be accustomed to, and should have an opinion on. But the point I was trying to make quickly, I'll clarify that. So I agree with you. If there's a choice, because you have three references at least which you give with an application, two or three, and if you have a choice between, say, a professor who is well known but you have not worked with him or her, and there's an assistant professor that you have worked with really in a very for a large period of time or on a project, then of course they definitely go for the assistant professor and request them for a reference. But in case you are lucky enough to have worked with a professor who is known in the field, for example in arbitration or IPR, and then you are applying for those kinds of LLMs, it definitely helps if you have a recommendation from the professor. But the key is, for getting any kind of reference letter, and if you want to be ethical in your application, is that you have to have worked with that professor, because otherwise it will all fall flat. You cannot just go for big names. That is a big no. If you go for big names and you have not worked with them, it is not going to do anything for your application. Might as well just take references from people you have worked with, and don't work with people for the sake of references. Now that is being too calculative. We've chosen through all kinds of things, and we have seen it. So don't be that calculative. But when you're planning your references, be careful in terms of whom you want that reference from. And of course, don't go blindly by the hierarchies. The important thing is that you would have to have worked with that particular academic in order for that reference to amount to something. Otherwise, it will amount to nothing, because the committee that sits there to assess applications is so accustomed to reading these applications that they know if somebody has done a good job with their application materials and somebody who hasn't. So that is something that has to be kept in mind.
Right. Professor, the next question, if you're willing to take this up again, is yes. So it's a very well put question. So we heard about the importance of knowing why one wants to do an LLM.
I hear you.
Yes,
and in what area? My question, and arrive at knowing your specialized interest in a particular field. Secondly, in LLM applications, one is required to write about one's specialized interest in a particular area and why they are picking a particular course in the field of law. How does one demonstrate that in the CV? And a CV is a mixed bag of experiences. So say if one wants to do an LLM in human rights, does their work experience in corporate firms affect their...
Please slow down. We are not understanding those questions. Okay. Break it down.
I think there's some problem with the I think with Zoom, I guess.
There's a problem with the connectivity. So just ask one question at a time.
I'll repeat. So the essence of the question is, the first part of the question is, how did you arrive at knowing that you wanted to pursue, or how did you know that this is your specialized area that you want to study further in? Secondly, if you have, let's say, if you have an experience in corporate firms, will that affect your application if you want to pursue your LLM in human rights?
Okay, no. Your experience in corporate law firms, working in corporate law firms, will not affect your human rights chances. I don't think, corporate law and human rights are, you might want to believe it in this. They're not antithetical. They can go along with each other. And I'm being cynical about human rights over here, not about corporate law. So, business and human rights is a very good model. I mean, it has become very, very popular area and branch of study these days. So I think merely because you've worked in a corporate law firm, you would be at a disadvantageous position. No, I mean, that's not a right way to go about thinking it. You can fashion your project in your CV or statement of purpose to show that how your particular experience shows you whatever inequity and whatever, and you want to renounce virtue and you want to become human rights, something of that sort. It's or else you can say, okay, I want to bring the two fields together and I want to make corporate law more responsive to human rights and so on. And so I don't and therefore I don't see the two as antithetical to each other. So you could work it around in whichever way. Right. As far as my interest is concerned, I mean, I kind of eliminated, as I mentioned. I was very sure that I didn't want that analytical, normative legal education. And I was also sure that I want to connect law to the humanities, right? And philosophy. And politics and the political. So when I went to SOAS, I took up precisely those courses, which allowed me to investigate these areas a little bit more. So I took up courses on Islamic law, South Asian law, law and governance, and there's a good course on government and politics in South Asia. And when I was at SOAS, I mean, this is a point that I didn't touch upon in discussion. How I spent my time. Of course, 1 year and 1 year is not enough. What can one really do in a year's time, right? So you need to reach out a bit more. So I did two things. I mean, I went to the London School of Economics and I audited a course on constitutional theory, and then eventually I ended up working with the person who taught us the course, Professor Martin Laughlin, for my PhD. And the other place where I went was Birkbeck. These are neighbors of SOAS. Birkbeck Law School, not very well known in India, but very, very prestigious in the critical legal studies field. And so I went there. I took courses over there. I remember I took up a course by, if you are into this field, Catherine Malibu, and it was a course on Agamben's, Homo Sacer that I took up, and that just completely blew me away, And so yeah, I mean, and of course, then that was really formative, for me. And then I came back and worked on my PhD proposal, and based on not just what I learned from SOAS, but also based on what I learned at LSE and Birkbeck and so on. And then this is how kind of and of course in the PhD other things started to happen, and my orientation changed even. There's no time for about it right now, but yeah, I mean, you have to basically you have to be open-minded, and you should allow. I mean, the problem with law and lawyers is that they love their certainty and certitude, right? The certainty and certitude that law offers, and without the anchor of law, they feel rudderless, right? So you should be open enough to kind of allow for that space. That okay, let me be taken up by something. Let something come, and completely, I'm ready to be completely blown away by this profound philosophical insight. Something present. So if you're ready, if you're open enough, then you don't need to worry about how you arrive at these calculations. I mean, things gradually, you should allow them to unravel. No one has a full picture of their lives, at such a young age, right? And you should allow things to grow on you, and gradually you would get to that eureka moment where you would know, okay, this is what my calling is, and I see myself for the next 2 years just doing this sort of work. There are no hard and fast, solutions or formulas of how do I, what is best for me.
Right, Professor. I agree that things should flow organically, and sometimes you just have a calling for something and you discover it in the way. Professor, there are just 2 more questions. So the first question is, what is your opinion about executive LLM, and how do you think professional recommendations are going to help in such LLMs?
I don't think I'm the right person to be asking this question. So I have very little idea of this program. Basically, I know that university offered it, but I'm not too sure what it is.
Right. Professor Moti, would you have some inputs on this?
Sure. So my 2 pence on this is that executive LLMs are gaining a lot of momentum these days, especially in a pandemic world. So whenever one is choosing to, maybe he or she is a working professional or somebody who does not have the time to pursue a full-time LLM and visit a campus and stay on campus and then do it in that manner, that is all right. I mean, executive LLMs are also gaining momentum and credibility slowly, but in comparison to the traditional LLMs that we have, which are on campus and something that is full time, they still have to get to that level. In my personal opinion, of course, people can differ. So, what I would suggest somebody who is in this position, they should apply for both kinds of LLMs, and depending upon the offers that they get and where they are at in life, they should decide on doing either or either one of the two kinds of LLMs. In terms of the market acceptability, I'm saying it's growing, but we are not at a level where it's acceptable by all companies and institutions, etc. So there is a sort of a dilemma with respect to whether one should do an executive LLM or not. So if somebody is thinking of
if you have a dilemma, then you should certainly go for the the traditional LLM.
Yes,
being conservative always
you
helps.
need to weigh. No, but Professor Moise, one has to weigh their pros and cons, because sometimes, what happens is, and I have the experience of working at a corporate law firm, and I saw a lot of these partners who wanted to do executive LLMs, and it was just an academic choice as opposed to something that is going to advance their careers. So the idea is, why are you doing it, and for what, to what end? So I think if there is a dilemma, then the person has to choose for him or herself, and depending on their circumstances. But definitely, I can make that statement that they're not at par with the traditional LLMs, the LLMs on campus. At least that's not the way they are viewed. So that's what I think. Yes.
Right.
Last question.
Right. Yes, Professor. The last question is for somebody who wants to work in the UK, how is a BCL better, or how is an LLM better? What is the difference between the two? And are major scholarships like Rhodes and Felix, are they available for somebody who wants to pursue a BCL?
Yes, BCL is actually nothing but the Masters of Law in Oxford. Right? So BCL, I mean, this is a good question actually, because as an undergraduate student, even I didn't know what BCL was. I mean, in the first, second year, I was, why is this fellow from NUJS, they've done a bachelor's, why are they going to do a bachelor in civil law at Oxford, right? And it's later, I mean, then I inquired with seniors, and then I figured out that, yeah, I mean, see, BCL is nothing. I mean, you can get into the intellectual history reasons why they call the law degree BCL, right? The deeper philosophical reasons for it. But it's nothing but the LLM. It's nothing but a master. It's just a nomenclatural difference. And Rhodes is only and exclusively for Oxford, not just law, but whichever course that you want to go for. It's only and exclusively for Oxford. Felix, as I just mentioned, there is Felix Oxford, Felix SOAS, and Felix Reading. As far as marketability is concerned, I mean, I wouldn't know, but of course, Oxford is on the radar hierarchy as far as the job market is. But yeah, I mean, you need to weigh all those options very carefully. You need to be very sure of what is it that this LLM or master's program is going to do for you, and then make the call. So, I mean, of course, it doesn't debar you if you go to SOAS for some other place. It doesn't mean that you can't get a good job. But yeah, I mean, just as is the case in India, I mean, some of the national law universities, they are better. I mean, they have a better market reputation compared to some other schools and colleges. So I think I would say that maybe BCL Oxford has a better market reputation compared to some of the other law courses.
Right, Professor. Thank you so much, Professor Moti. I just saw that two more students have popped up. Two more questions. So, do you think we should take
Okay,
it up
go
now?
ahead very quickly. You know, you can
Okay,
see the two questions
all right,
together.
all right, Professor. So, the first question that I'm going to ask is, what is the difference between a BCL and an MJOR? Can a student from India pursue an MJOR?
I mean, I forget the difference. You know, MJOR is masters. I mean, I think you know. Originally, I thought that MJOR is basically for people in the continental world who want to come to Oxford and do the masters. Right? MJOR was for European people, and BCL was for those who have had a common law training, right? So for India, America, some other such countries. So I mean, I think this is. I mean, I vaguely remember, but this is what
That's correct.
the two is. I mean, you can, but I mean, they're opening it up, and I don't know. I mean, how Indians are lost. Again, there's not much of a difference, right, in terms of the courses and all. It's just nomenclature.
Right. Professor, the next question is, as stated by you earlier, certain universities in the US lean towards work experience, leaving graduates as in a disadvantageous situation. So, in such a case, should students still apply to these universities?
That you might be able to find out from colleagues who are your immediate seniors, right? Who you feel, okay, someone whom you know has got admitted to Harvard or Yale or Michigan or whichever law school. And you know, specifically, if you are in touch with them, they might be able to tell you better, because these criteria and these requirements are, because all these universities are autonomous, right? So they have different admission policies, and it's very specific from course to course, university to university. So that only a person who has enrolled for a particular course, they would be able to tell whether simply with a graduate degree, undergraduate degree in India, is it sufficient, or do you require a couple of years of work experience ideally for you to be able to have a good shot at admission process. So that, you know, I can't say offhand, you know, there can't be any general response to this question.
Right, Professor. So, with this, we come to the end of the question answer session. Thank you for extending the session and giving us your time. Professor Moti, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Trapti, and thank you, Professor Moez, for answering those questions so patiently. So, on behalf of the Committee for the Academic Support on Higher Education and Learning, I thank you for taking out the time, sharing your experiences, and replying to the questions posed by the students in such a wonderful manner. We could not have thought of a better and more accomplished speaker to kickstart our higher education series. I'm sure students have learned a lot from today's insightful interaction, and this will contribute towards their academic pursuits. I would like to invite you for your closing remarks, Professor Moez, before we end the session for today.
Yes, I mean, thanks so much, Shireen, and you know, Tripti and Visha and everyone else, you who are working here. It was great to interact with you, and you know, you know, once again, I would reiterate that, you know, if you just pursue your passion, you should not compromise with whatever, wherever your passion takes you, right? And all these getting admission, getting scholarships, these are, you know, slightly more derivative questions. The more originally thing is passion, right? And if you are passionate about something for long enough, then I'm sure that whether you get admitted, whether you get scholarships, you would be able to make a mark for yourself in that respective field of study that you want to excel in. So this is all. I mean, this is what I lack. This is what I feel lacking in a lot of students and people. They're very, very career oriented, career driven. You know, very calculative about every step that they take, that they want to take. And what I find missing is the zing, you know, the passion can bring to the table. So if that is taken care of, I think you are allowed to make, you know, outlandish choices as well. Right? So, anyways, I mean, all the very best. And if there is anything that after this conversation you think I can help you out with, please feel free to write to me. I would be, happy to I can be of help.
Thank you, Professor Moiz, and thank you to all the students for asking such insightful questions and for making for a very interactive session today. I hope you have gained a lot of insight. And as you know, the Committee for Academic Support of Higher Education and Learning is there to make your higher education academic dreams a reality. So we are facilitators, and do reach out to us on cashel@jgu.edu.in, and our faculty members are going to help you with your applications. Thank you, Tripti, for taking up the Q&A session, and today's webinar has ended now. Thank you. Thank you.